So with me tonight is Richard Sambrook, head of global news at BBC, Adrian Wells, head of foreign news at Sky, and Jean Seaton, who at one time was the historian for BBC and is now head of the Research Institute at Westminster University's Media and Communication School, more or less, got it right? Okay. And our topic tonight are news black holes, if you will. Places where it's difficult, if not impossible, for the media to cover the story. Why this is so, what can be done to get around these obstacles? What are the dangers of not being there, and what the plus and minuses of such things as citizen journalism? But to sort of set the stage first, perhaps we can look at a few areas where there is an acute problem. And I think I'll start with Iran, if I may, where after the disputed election, foreign journalists were just squeezed out of the country, and the beam hung on for a long time, but eventually everybody was more or less squeezed out. And perhaps I could start with you, Richard. How did they do it, and what have you done to try to get around the problem?
Okay, well, we'd had a correspondent fully accredited in the bureau in Iran for a long time, but we started to fall out with the authorities when we wanted to launch Persian TV, because the Iranian authorities are less bothered about what's broadcast about Iran to the rest of the world, but are, like many countries, very concerned and acutely concerned about what is broadcast to their own population. So when we started to broadcast in Farsi into Iran, they started to get quite agitated with the BBC, and in the end threw our correspondent out as a point of principle, because we continued to persevere with our Persian service. So we were served obviously by the agencies for a while, but then they put pressure on the agencies to say if they continued to supply BBC Persian TV, they would be thrown out. And so AP started to block or say we couldn't use any of their material on Persian TV. Reuters, to their credit, ignored the threat and carried on and said, we have a deal with you, you can use it, and stayed on, and I think are still there. How did we get by? In the end, it was because of the relationship between our Persian TV channel and the audiences inside Iran, because at the height of the protests, sort of 5-6 days in, we were receiving between 6 and 8 video clips a minute from people inside Iran. Now, Iran, I'm sure people here know better than I do, but it is a very kind of internet-savvy country. It's a very high number of blogs and highly educated, highly cultured. So from that point of view, here was a population, and a young population, a very young country. I think it's more than 50% are under 30, something like that. So here was a kind of population ripe to use new technology and to use social media and to use all of those tools to tell their story and express their experience. Now, I mean, that was in one sense, that was fantastic for us to have this flood of material, because we actually were able to use that as the spine of our coverage of events there. But of course, there are a number of issues around that, and I'm sure we'll get into discussing them further as this kind of session goes on. But firstly, how do we verify what we're getting? How do we know it's what people are telling us it is? Obviously, it was quite difficult for us to get back in touch with people and to verify them, and we had to be very careful about not identifying them on air and so on as well. And there were a number of other of those kind of editorial policy issues about how we use that material. But in the end, new technology and a population that wanted to express itself got us out of what would otherwise have been a black hole in terms of coverage. One other point I should make, of course, is that most of that material came from people on the streets and the protesters. One of the issues for us was, Iran is a country that's split down the middle, and Ahmadinejad, whatever other people feel about him, still has 40-50% support, and his supporters actually were less inclined to come onto our airwaves, and we had to work quite hard to think about how do we explain that this isn't just on one side of the picture. How do we explain there is a different view in Iran from the one that the people on the street were expressing? So that was a challenge for us.
Incidentally, I'll come to the audience at some point. We have an hour and a half, but if you think we're talking total nonsense, or you have you feel you must make a point, don't hesitate to raise your hand, and you can interrupt even if you prefer. Adrian, was your experience more or less, hand down there?
Yes, I was wondering what made you think that
But could you identify yourself, where you're from, and what, your background?
Hi, my name is Kelly Nicknajad. I'm the editor-in-chief of TehranBureau.com. I was wondering what made you think that Ahmadinejad had 50% of these silent supporters who were reluctant to come out and show their support for their new president.
Well, I'm sure you have a more detailed and closer understanding of it than I do, but I think it's the notion that there is, an authoritarian government and an entire population that are set against them. From my experience of Iran, I've been there about a year ago, and from discussing it with our Persian teams and so on, is to say there is a significant body, whether it's 50% or 40% or 60%, we can all debate, but there is a significant body of people in the rural communities and other parts of the population who do strongly support Ahmadinejad. And for our Persian service, we have to make sure that in some way we reflect that and make it clear that this isn't simply the voice from the street and nothing else. And we're not there to be simply the TV channel for the protesters. We're there to be Iranian TV that reflects Iranian society and Iranian political debate in its full breadth.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Rana Rangipour from Persian TV. I was actually talking about the black holes
When
that
you're
we
saying,
had.
are you IRIB?
No, BBC Persian TV
sorry.
reporter. One of the black holes we actually had on those days is because of the internet speed of Iran and the UGCs that we were getting. We were not sure whether it happened on the same day or it was filmed a few days ago and it was gradually being sent to us. So that was very scary because I was responsible for verifying some of them, and we had to just rewind everything again and again to make sure that it's the same street, the mosque they're talking about, and it was really risky because sometimes Ahmadinejad supporters called us and they said BBC Persian's trying to intrigue people to come out to the streets, and we had to make sure that they're the same story.
Let me move to Adrian, so we'll go to Sky now. How did you vet material that came in, and did you have similar problems, and were you in a different position because you weren't widely seen and heard in Iraq?
Yeah, we had the same problem, and I guess we were at a disadvantage in comparison with the BBC, who had that, the Persian service, who, as a way of reaching out to people and getting that content. And nevertheless, we still did get quite a lot, whether it was directly to us or via YouTube posts or Twitter, of course. It was definitely it was the moment when Twitter exploded into our consciousness as a really, really powerful news gathering tool. And we made very good play of that. Funnily enough, 3 or 4 months ago, before that had happened, we'd actually appointed one of our online team to be a Twitter correspondent, which was a pretty backwater role until, frankly, the Iranian rallies that started happening. It became a very frontline role for us in terms of our on-screen reporting. But there were the same sort of problems with verification of Twitter. I mean, for example, we felt there were several good Twitterers who we'd been tracking, who we felt pretty sure were making real and up-to-date contributions about what was going on, on the streets of Tehran. But then as it started to explode as a phenomenon, we found more and more people coming in and joining and posting who we were less sure about. I mean, we tracked one Turanian Twitterer down to Streatham, for example, and where apparently things were getting pretty bad. So there were issues like that, and we found we had to weed certain people out. We did a lot of digging back on people. We had 5 or 6 in the end, people who we really trusted, and we gave prominence to them. Were we absolutely sure? No, we're not, actually. Unless someone can chase an IP address down to wherever, internet cafe, it's quite hard to do. So nevertheless, it's a good tool. It's definitely not a catch-all solution to problems. If a country wants to not give you a visa, or some heavies turn up in the Lale Hotel and chuck you out, that's a pretty powerful way of chopping off coverage. And we found that was the case with our teams as well. If you don't have your primary news gatherers there, if you don't have your own teams there, it is a very, very blunt instrument, but effective. And Twitter, YouTube posts, UGC, citizen journalism, fantastic. Not something we want to, just have, but we had to make use of it in that scenario.
Well, this brings up the whole question of the value and the pitfalls of do-it-yourself journalism. There was an article by, I think it was Christian Science Monitor correspondent, they're web journalists now, they don't have a paper anymore, a few months ago, in which he suggested that citizen journalism is about as appealing as citizen dentistry. Maybe Jean could comment a little bit on it. Overstated, perhaps, but.
I don't know. I mean, I suppose the what's very interesting is that you get new technologies which do open up extraordinary new things, but the problems remain. The fundamental principles remain absolutely the same. How do you know that this is a true story? How do you know that it's, and governments are as good, I mean, I think we've seen that there's always a kind of technological utopianism at the beginning of a technology in which people believe that the technological breakthrough you've just had is on the side of democracy and the people and, love and rock and roll and good things. And then you find that, in fact, that technology, even though as I get older, I think I'm more of a technological determinist actually. And this is an incredible technologically driven revolution we're living through. But governments learn too. They're not stupid. It isn't just the people who take things over. Groups learn too. And so the issues of how you know that what you are, it seems to be the two really big problems are as it were, the classic problem of balance. And the example that comes to mind is again Tibet, because that was the BBC was absolutely swamped with anti-Han Chinese stuff. And in fact, there was and the BBC's problem was to actually come up with the other side. Meanwhile, the entire nation of China thought that the BBC, particularly any Chinese student in Britain, of which there are huge numbers, we had a meeting actually organised by Suzanne at the back, in which there were about 300 Chinese who were students in Britain who burst into tears at the horror of the injustice and the pain that the BBC had inflicted on them by not representing the Han case enough. I mean, so you could murder lots of people, you can destroy a culture, but so there are two questions, one of which is how do you know that the stuff is accurate and it's coming from, and secondly, how do you know what the context of the story is? Because you can't balance it just out of the stuff that's coming in. You have to balance it. It was very interesting that Richard said, it was really interesting, what you said was we had a problem with balancing. From my own experience in Iran, I've been there, our team in Iran, the Persian television team, i.e. the thing that permitted you to adjudicate was in a way lay outside the new technology. So that's I'm not against any of it. I'm just sort of saying that it doesn't eradicate in principle journalism the problem of balance, what the real story is, that you're not going with the herd and that you're not being nobbled.
Yeah.
The lady in black in the back rows.
Thank you. I'm Mary Dejevsky from The Independent. I had a question for Richard Stott. You were very diplomatic in the way you dealt with what you were doing with Iran.
Yeah.
But if you were sort of more polemical and from the outside...
I'm from the BBC.
Yes. you might say that the Persian service of the BBC actually acted, its very existence acted against the interests of BBC reporting worldwide, in that you actually sacrificed a fully accredited, extremely experienced, well-informed correspondent who was broadcasting to the rest of the world and to the UK for the sake of the continuation of the BBC Persian service, which was basically acting as an internal broadcasting service to Iran. I'd just like your comment on that.
Yeah, you won't be surprised I don't agree. I mean, I think, firstly, governments, whether or not you have a Persian service or any other international service going into a country, governments who don't like your coverage will do all sorts of things to try to blackmail you and force you and squeeze you out. And that happens, all over the world all the time. And if you kind of give way and you say, oh, okay, we'll pull back here, they just try and take another mile. So, that's part of life of operating big, particularly international news services. And I would say, and actually I think most people in the BBC newsrooms and on the news desk would say that the advantages of having the Persian service and the direct relationship with people inside Iran that it has developed, and the information and intelligence and understanding that we have gathered and harvested, if you like, as a consequence of that, far outweighs the disadvantage of temporarily being without a correspondent. And these are hard trade-offs, and in the end, I just think if you, I don't know if there's anyone here from AP, and I don't particularly want to single them out, but I think if you give way to authoritarian regimes in the long term, doesn't do any good. And you have points of principle, and our principle is we want that service, we're doing a decent job broadcasting it, and we will hold the line and we'll take the consequences.
There was another question.
I'm Gwyneth Henderson, ex-BBC World Service, Open Society Institute. I think we're talking about Persian television, which started earlier this year. The fact is, of course, the BBC's been broadcasting to Iran for, actually, I don't know how long,
60
but
years.
it's 60 years odd or whatever.
Second World War.
It was one of the first as part of that. But I mean, the reality is that knowledge, and I entirely agree with Jean, is a lot deeper than 6 months ago, and that radio team, and I think it's also, we've had a crisis in Iran, a huge crisis, which was not of anybody outside's making, but the fact is we've had a BBC English language correspondent all the way through the years of the radio service, which has, not as big an audience as the television, but had a pretty sizable audience. So, they threw John Line out because it was a crisis, and, blame anybody.
Yeah.
So, yes. And
But they
you
didn't close down.
can't not stop broadcasting to Iran, which I might argue is a bit more important, actually, during these times. Than
But the other point, I agree. The other point I make is that other organisations had their correspondents thrown out who didn't have Farsi services. So whether or not you have a Persian service doesn't determine whether you get thrown out.
Yes, exactly.
Jean, you touched on a point, the point that there is sometimes perhaps we miss the other side of the story, or most stories don't have just two sides, they have perhaps 4 or 5. Take a look at Darfur, for example. I mean, it was the classic story, the goodies and the baddies when we first started. Very difficult to cover, and eventually, there were ways to do it. You went in with NGOs. Now, of course, the NGOs have been kicked out. Has the story changed there? I mean, you hear of nasty things being done by the rebels. You hear various rebel groups fighting against each other. Have we sort of missed the story? Adrian, have you any thoughts on this?
Yeah, funnily enough, I shouldn't give away any trade secrets, but we're trying to go back at the moment to Darfur for exactly that reason, because you do these things, to some extent are fashionable. Stories come in and come out of the news agenda, and Darfur isn't that fashionable at the moment. Maybe, George Clooney's been busy making films or something. It hasn't been at the top of the agenda recently, and one suspects that not a lot has changed. It is a real challenge, Darfur. It's a huge, issue getting there, and no one really has ever completely nailed on television or radio, as far as I'm aware, the real, actual persecution happening, or the very direct aftermath of it. And as a consequence, you find yourself as a news organisation always chasing the story, and never feeling satisfied that you've got to the bottom of what's going on there. And of course, it's incredibly complicated, with different militia being sponsored by different parts of the government who are themselves factionalised, and et cetera, et cetera. So, I believe it is important when we in the media, do our part to to put these issues right at the very top of the news agenda, that we do revisit them. And we don't just sort of consign them to being yesterday's or last year's news story. We do have a responsibility to follow up. But it is hard, and you know, sometimes it's hard making a case for a news item on Darfur to be included on a program editor's running order, because there doesn't seem to be a particular reason why it should be there, apart from these rather more lofty ideas that I'm talking about. And that can be hard in itself to sort of sell the idea. So are we missing things in Darfur? We probably are. Is the media in general doing enough to sort of keep with that story? I suspect we're probably not. You know, there aren't that many Twitterers in the refugee camps of Chad and Sudan, you know, so we don't even have that open to us. And so technology is not always a resource for us.
Well, I can think of another, yes, question in the back.
Hi, I'm Susan Schulman, a freelance photojournalist and filmmaker. And all I can answer with regard
Can you
to
speak into the mic, please?
Sorry. With regard to Darfur, after a year making it happen, I ended up spending a month embedded with UNIMID in last October, 2008, and had a very extremely privileged position by virtue of whatever. And all I can say in shorthand is, and I'd be happy to talk to anyone in depth more about it, is that I have never in my life been somewhere which so failed to conform to any stereotype, and for which the story was so patently not the one that is most commonly known. I mean, and it was absolutely extraordinary. And I have the material to prove it and show it, and I'd be happy to talk
Where
to
did the
someone
media
more.
get the story wrong? Just briefly.
Okay, well, the whole tune about these are the evil ones and these are the victims is completely and utterly wrong. Or rather, I won't say it's completely and utterly wrong, but it's far more complicated. And the whole society now has been completely transformed by virtue of the long-term IDP camps. It's a fascinating system. And I found that overall the refugees were actually, the IDPs were begging for weapons. They want weapons. They're disgusted with the whole thing. They don't want anything else. And even within that community, they were telling me that it's gotten far more complicated through the attention of the international community and the way they have cast that story. And it's evident, absolutely evident, that they're playing us at our own tune. I mean, I was all over. I was in North Darfur, South Darfur. I was all over. And in fact, it wasn't uncommon that someone would say, well, actually, we're just the victims and everything. And I'd say, well, actually, you've just told me how you want to overthrow the government. Don't you think that might actually influence the attitude toward you? And they chuckled. I mean, I've got it all on film. They chuckled because they knew they were rumbled. So the sophistication of the IDP community is actually very interesting. And I mean, it was absolutely. Can
I just say in response to that, because I think this is something we haven't touched on, and it's not perhaps as sexy as Twitter and all the rest of it, but. I'm also chairman of the Rory Peck Trust, which tries to represent the interests of freelance news gatherers like yourself. And actually, I think it's worth saying that the broadcasters, whether it's staff correspondents based in bureaus or whether we're subscribing to Twitter, you've just outlined an essential articulation of what the freelancer can contribute to, journalism across the piece. Whether you end up doing that story for Channel 4, for Sky, or for BBC, or whoever, that underlines, in fact, the ability that you've had to put that sort of time on the ground together, which perhaps a broadcaster sending a staffer for a year to Darfur is not really going to do that, frankly. And that is a classic articulation of a very, very important tool for us. So the broadcaster's relationship with the freelance community is just as, perhaps more important than their relationship with someone who's got a mobile phone in the right place at the right time.
And I just had one comment to that. That what you say depends on a broadcaster's ability, or desire, willingness to buy and purchase. And in
Absolutely.
fact, that's where it all.
Absolutely.
You raised the interesting point of governments playing the media. And is it possible that governments sometimes overplay their hands and it's counterproductive? And I'm thinking of Gaza, the Israeli government, the Israeli army, and the shutting people out of Gaza. How do you think that played out for the two sides?
I mean, there's a kind of implication in the way you phrased the question, Tom, which is that it backfired on the Israelis because they had all these people lined up on the border saying, we're not allowed in, we can't tell you what's going on.
They roll up on that silly little hill.
Exactly, and
right.
then you had, the bits coming out and all the rest of it. If I was in the IDF or the Israeli government, I'm not sure I would say that, actually. And I think they may think it was rather successful.
Okay.
And, I think... it's not just on Gaza. There've been, or Iran. There are a lot of other places where actually the physical obstruction to allowing access for governments which may wish to do whatever they want to do behind closed doors and then manage the narrative, is actually a very crude but quite effective device. And I think we're facing that more and more. I mean, the Israeli authorities, I think, are becoming increasingly sophisticated. They learned from the Lebanon conflict. They've learned from Gaza. They're now on Twitter and all the rest of it. They're finding new ways to shape the narrative and get their message out. But in the end, those rather crude devices of simply closing the border and allowing them the space to do whatever they want to do, in their terms, I think is quite effective. In our media terms, of course, we think, we can show them up to be repressive or whatever else we may feel about whatever government it is. But I'm not sure if you're within that government, that I think that's probably a price you're prepared to pay.
But there's another angle when the military tries to shape the news, and I'm thinking of Afghanistan and Iraq, of course, where the only way to get to where the action is quite frequently is to embed yourself to go with the military. And maybe Adrian could talk a little bit about the plus and minuses. Do you embed? Don't you embed? What are the criterion? We have the recent example of Stephen Farrell, who was just kidnapped several days ago in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, we're all probably, familiar with those pluses and minuses, as you say. I mean, there's some big pluses and some big minuses. And, the pluses are, of course, that you get to places that you wouldn't otherwise get to without dying, for sure. So that's a big plus, and clearly...
Well, you sometimes die.
Yeah, sometimes you die anyway, yeah.
Did.
The other plus side is that, of course, whether it's American or British troops and their involvement in Afghanistan or wherever it might be is a central part of the story as well. So that's clearly, something that you would want to do from that point of view. The minuses are, of course, it gives you a very partial picture.
Absolutely.
And, the Afghanistan, just for the election, was a very good example of that, where we were on an embed with the US Marines, actually, but the whole emphasis of the embed was to try and get next to the local community. What are the Afghan army doing to facilitate safety of polling stations, et cetera, et cetera. So you can try and turn the embeds to what you want. But at the end of the day, you're going back to a camp and you're living with the squaddies or with the American forces, and you're not able to outreach as much. Now in Afghanistan, you can. There are places you can go. I mean, not everywhere do you have to be on an embed.
Yeah.
Kabul,
Kabul's
Herat province, Mazar-e-Sharif. There are places that you can go if you think about it and plan carefully. And we try and do that. But then, of course, there are risks, as you mentioned the case with Stephen Farrell, which is ongoing. And these are very fine judgments that you make. I don't think anyone is saying you shouldn't do embed journalism. You have to do embed journalism because otherwise you're cutting your leg off in terms of what you're able to do as a news gatherer. But you go in with your eyes open, and when you're filing a report, you tell people the context in which it's been put together. And as long as you're honest with the viewer, I think the viewer now is very savvy, and they're fully aware of the circumstances usually of how things are put together, and it's important that we keep saying that.
Two things it seems to me emerge out of that. One of which is that as the resource for news making is under fantastic, news collecting is under enormous pressure and is kind of dissolving, really. So the resource for getting news is getting smaller. The resources going into some institutions we love and approve of, like the MOD, which has got a new military strategy. It's got a new wonderful military strategy, which is all about information, and I forget the technical name. They use acronyms so much. The resources going into institutions who are trying to manage the story is actually growing hugely. And you gave the example of the Israeli army, very old-fashioned, but Israel, Gaza's very, very old-fashioned, actually, just don't let people in. The step on from that is the Ministry of Defence, you know, and I speak as somebody with, you know, soldier godsons. So in fact, I think soldiers, there's a good story, I'm not against embed, but the amount of resource going into a very relatively, you know, we could have another discussion about that actually, I think inefficient, but enormously institutionalised, growing attempt by even the British Army to manage all sorts of aspects of the story, which, for instance, leaves squaddies unable now to speak to you directly. And that's just one bit of it. All over the world, there are institutions who are getting lots of resources to, in a sense, spend on managing fewer and fewer journalists, and that seems to me a kind of
really interesting
problem. A problem.
Asymmetric warfare.
Well, Rupert Smith's wonderful book on warfare is the book that grasps that. So I think there is a sort of, you need to put it in the context of all the other things that are happening, really.
We haven't touched on Sri Lanka and the Tamil Tigers. Is the story over? I mean, we, the Western media, were pretty much shut out.
Yeah.
Should we go back and revisit it? Is there some way we can go back and revisit it? I saw Jon Snow last night berating an official in Colombo and saying, you know, just invite me in. I'll come tomorrow, you know. Of course, he won't be invited.
Yeah.
You have some thoughts, Richard?
There are probably, again, people here who are better qualified than me to talk about it. I don't think, I'd be surprised if the story's over, and it's incredibly difficult, particularly for Western organisations to get in and report it. Of course, again, you know, I'm currently representing an international broadcaster who has, you know, deeper connections into, you know, countries like Sri Lanka and so on, and is able to reflect the views within the country probably more easily, and particularly in languages and the vernacular services and so on. But for the mainstream news organisations, it is incredibly difficult. And, you know, so they shut us out, you know, they kind of declare that it's all over, but you can be sure it can't be in some ways. And, you know, a conflict that's lasted that long and has been, you know, that difficult and that violent can't possibly end that quickly. So.
But I mean, the other thing I think about Sri Lanka is that there's a technological determinism that says everywhere is the same, whereas in fact sociologically you look at societies which are enormously different in their capacity. They've got basically, it's really, Iran's got a large educated middle class, as Eastern Europe had during the Cold War. Sri Lanka doesn't. So it's not just the technology; it's the access to it. And the capacity to get stories, the capacity to have links outside, all of those things.
Sure. Though again, there are, you know, significant you know, blogs and group blogs, and, you know, there are stories that are getting out through social media to an extent.
John Owen has a question.
Just on that, doesn't journalism have a responsibility then to hold accountable what happens in those black holes? We've seen those mobile phone images, horrific images of what took place in Sri Lanka. We know now better what happened in Gaza when cameras weren't there, at least except for Al Jazeera. Doesn't journalism, you guys, have a responsibility, even though the story has moved on, to go back and hold accountable what was done while your cameras weren't there?
Now that's a tough. Let's start with an academic answer, and then a practitioner.
Well, I mean, actually, I thought out of the Gaza Strip, the single significant, one of the most important pieces of journalism was the Jeremy Bowen panorama afterwards, which did exactly that. He went in and actually, brick by accusatory brick, but never saying it, he stacked the case for a variety of war crimes, though he talked to both sides. So I think that was that panorama, in which, I think he must have been very well produced, because he was quite, we had less
Speak frankly, Jean.
We had less Jeremy and more argument.
He's not here. You're right.
We had it was. I thought he must have had a very. That in itself is very interesting. I think he must have had a very. Or he was so angry that he repressed himself, or there was a very good producer with him.
It's not like him.
But I mean, I think that was a very good example of journalism that knew what it was doing, that once it could get in, made actually an almost perfect case. But I mean, that was late. I think there's a separate issue about stories that just fall off the world's vision. I mean, that's what you're talking about, Darfur. It's there's stories that are going on. What do you need to rank them up? The news interest. And one answer, of course, is the ancient answer, again, rather an ancient answer, is news editors who've been there and seen it and know it, who understand that this story, it's still going on. There's a very, very, the journalist's biggest enemy is always the news editor, who doesn't care. So there is there's almost like a cycle in which you get the news decisions that your news editors have got some experience of. Anyway. But that seems to be a separate issue, how you put back into consciousness a story which goes on, which is enduringly bad, but how you kind of rev it up again.
The lady in the back, and then you. The two ladies, I'm sorry, the first one.
I just wanted to...
Speak into the mic, please.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I don't think you can begin to compare Iran with Sri Lanka in terms of population and demographics. Obviously, in a developing country, people don't have mobile phones.
That's what I was saying.
They just don't have that. It's a really huge problem. And just related to your sort of comment about PR and how different causes have a different amount of PR. Obviously, the government of Sri Lanka have had an incredibly good PR machine over the years, and the Tamil people have had no PR. Absolutely. And the only PR they've had is through the LTTE, which hasn't represented everyone. So it's a completely polarised debate, and unfortunately, the Western press, whoever, journalists, activists, simply don't know the stories that are in the north, and so I do think there is a huge need for some kind of PR. That's a horrible word to use for all those people who are suffering, but until that changes, I can't see why Western media or Westerners or the international community will take an interest.
Do you have a question?
No, sorry.
No, statements are fine. The other lady, please.
Yeah, it's partly what we were saying also with regards to Sri Lanka. Sorry, Juliana Rufus from Al Jazeera. And how stories are being covered and when you revisit them. I think there's also, and we are in the age of a 24-hour news channel, of course, a difference between news and programs. And I think sometimes news is there to keep up with the story, but then you have people in programming, and of course Jeremy Boehm's piece was a panorama, it was part of programming, and that revisits. And I imagine, for example, that the Sri Lanka conflict and how things are being pieced together, that might happen in programming. And I mean, for us, I know that we at Al Jazeera are thinking about how we can integrate both more. And I would imagine, and I don't know in how far that's happening, that is something that's across the board.
Yeah, I mean, just in reply to John's question, the answer, of course, is yes. And, Jean's given a very good example. I mean, I suppose another example would be Rwanda, where I do think that, after Rwanda, we did eventually get back in and hold people to account and really try and understand what had taken place there. But, sometimes it can take some time. I do, just to throw something completely different into the mix, one of the things that worries me most as we see a lot of news moving online, and most people, whatever time scale you want to say, online is clearly going to have a very significant part of the future of news, is it's very difficult to do current affairs or in-depth analysis online. It doesn't work online, let alone on a mobile phone. And I think that's a different kind of black hole that we're facing over the next 5 to 10 years, really. We've got to work out, if everything else is moving online, what happens to analysis and investigation and in-depth journalism?
Does anybody in the audience think that there's a story where the Western media have had difficulty getting in, or they've been shut out, or other problems where we've really gotten the story wrong? Oh, well, that's good. Go ahead.
I'd just like to ask about Burma. Sorry, just to
Burma.
pick up some of the things that you were talking about earlier to do with Twitter and blogs and what happened in Iran. I mean, it happened before with Burma, that we were getting stuff out through mobile phones or whatever, but also through, if you like, activist media organizations like Mizima and Democratic Voice of Burma and whatever, who did some really, and you were happy to take that, albeit, it went through the process of the editorial process, whatever. But they still exist. They've still got material coming out. They're still broadcasting back into Burma, telling those stories or whatever. And yet now we only ever hear about Burma when, I mean, quite rightly that we do, when it's a story about Aung San Suu Kyi. Why aren't we hearing the rest of the story about Burma? Because there is access to the information.
That sounds like a BBC question. No?
Well, it's not a bit. I don't think it's BBC. I think it's for all. It's all for all main news organisations, and we're in a room full of people who would very easily subscribe to the notion that we need to have more international news coverage and the importance of international news coverage. And I doubt if anybody's taken the trouble to come here tonight would disagree with that. But if you're sitting on a news desk for a programme that's aimed at a UK audience in early tea time in a very competitive television schedule, the issues are sometimes different. And, we may be uncomfortable with that, but it's a fact. And, Adrian will face that, and ITN will face it, and, The Guardian faces it, and, that's the fact of making those news decisions about what is your readership, what is your audience, what are the competitive pressures, how do you try and maintain your presence, and how do you balance giving people what they need with what they want, the classic kind of dilemma. And, in that funnel and in that squeeze, I'm afraid, a lot of international news, particularly for domestic and national audiences and public, gets squeezed out. I don't like it, and I would love to think in the age of 24-hour news, and I think to the extent we can with the internet and so on, there is space to get more of those stories out. And I do think one of the advantages of social media is, again, you can start to get more of that story out. It's not going to be the lead story on the 6 o'clock news, but it is still going to get discussed and it's going to get aired.
Can I just do an ad? Because I think in a way news is always quite often hunkers down as if other things that go on around it don't influence it. But this is an ad, which is that I run something called the Orwell Prize, and this is the anniversary. This year is the anniversary of Orwell's Burmese Days. So this whole year, starting with our launch debate on the 29th of October here, we're gonna try and pick up Burma, because we've got Burmese Days, we've got lots of things, and there's a curious way in which we're going to do some drama, and we're going to take it to the Oxford Literary Festival, and we're going to take arguments about Burma all over the place, and I think there is a way in which news, in a good way, news can inform all sorts of other things that aren't just current events, as it were, that raise issues rather like your film. And alternatively, such events can feed back into what a news agenda is. But that's just an ad, because I feel that we've got a whole year planned round Orwell on Burma, on raising Burma.
A big component of what's news is the word new. I mean, that's the problem.
Exactly.
And there's this messy relationship, as Richard was alluding to, about what is news, i.e. what is new, and that might well be Aung San Suu Kyi, her trial, or whatever it might be. And then there's the agenda, all this stuff that we're concerned about, like tens of millions of people dying of malaria over 10 years, or whatever it might be. And we're all conscious of the agenda, and we're all informed by it, and we all read the inside pages and all the rest of it. And we who work in international news try and find ways of, if you like, accessing the agenda through different opportunities.
Exactly.
Almost in a way to present it as news, because at times that's what we're doing. We're parceling it. But it is a tough sell. It is a tough sell. Tough sell for a channel like Sky to sort of hey, let's revisit Burma. It's not always an easy sell.
The other question was the usage, because you talked earlier about the need to have to be very careful of citizen journalism, whatever, which I completely accept. But it's the fact that there is access through other sources to material, which are real stories, if you like, from it. And Burma, as I say, has just, surely there is a responsibility to tell the end of the story. I wish it were the end of the story, but you know what I mean. And I think people were very interested, you remind them,
why wouldn't they be interested again?
But
What's happened to all those?
isn't one of the great things about the way that the internet, and I don't want to eulogise about the internet, but one of the great things about what it's providing is if you feel passionately about Burma, you can go and find out an enormous amount about Burma and what's happening there. And to say, but that has to be at the top of the 6 o'clock news, well, actually, there's plenty of other opportunities and ways of finding out and engaging and discussing and all the rest of it. And that, I think, is one of the really big pluses of the way that media, and in particular news media, is developing at the moment.
You have 24-hour early news, and so does Sky. I'm not talking about leading the 6 o'clock news, actually.
Yeah, but
I'm talking about-
sure, but all of those channels still need to pull in the audience to justify their existence. And actually, the sad truth for you and me, because I care about Burma too, is that Burma may not do it. And Burma's certainly got to find its place in the mix of enormous range of other issues.
Let me inject something else.
Yeah.
Talking about people dying, you have almost 10 years of an extremely nasty war in the DRC in the Congo. Thousands of people dying. It's been going on and on and on. Why do we see so little of this?
Well, Africa, you're absolutely right to seize on Africa, presents the biggest challenges in terms of this relationship between news, agenda, and what you might call ongoing. Burma is ongoing, and conflict is in DRC, ongoing, problems of famine, of disease, ongoing. And that's really where it's at. We know, working in this national news, that these things are incredibly important and often too much ignored. But it falls into the category of ongoing.
But that's self-imposed censorship, is it not?
But also not only from us, but also from the international community, for whom it's also ongoing. Exactly. Governments do not engage in it. Even governments within Africa don't engage on it.
But governments don't engage in it because we don't engage in it.
Chicken and egg.
Chicken and egg.
Okay. Can I say two things? One thing we've only just touched on tangentially is safety. And I think a big issue, and I speak as someone who's deeply involved in INSEE, the New Safety Institute and so on, is some things don't get reported because we can't get there without getting killed or without the risk being too great to take.
Correct.
And that happens in all sorts of places. It certainly happens in conflicts in Africa. It's true in Somalia. It's true why there's fewer independent operations in Iraq in 2003 than there were in 91, for example. So, safety is becoming more and more dangerous to report conflicts.
How much do you rely on the correspondents or the team's own wishes, and how much do you impose on them? And are there certain limits beyond which you will not let people go?
Well, firstly, nobody goes into a conflict zone unless they volunteer. So that's a principle, a long-standing principle in the BBC. Even if they volunteer, there is professional judgment. We now have, ex-military advisors and safety advisors and risk assessments and all of those things that have to be in place. In the end, though, there is a judgment, and my view as someone as an editor and running news gathering and now as running divisions and all the rest of it has been that the people best placed to make that judgment are the people on the ground. Absolutely. But they have to be informed by what you know back in head office as well. But if you have an experienced team on the ground who've got all of the advice and the support that they can ask for, in the end they have to try and make that judgment because they're closest to what's happening and they're in the best place to make that decision.
Would you agree, Adrian?
Yeah. Absolutely. Sorry.
My name is Brendan and I work for an independent production company up in North London. So very much the programming side of journalism versus news. My question is about using political groups or sort of, I guess you'd call them citizen journalists, but they have a real agenda to make your programs. We mentioned the DRC and we mentioned Burma, both of which have been the subject of very good Channel 4 dispatches, an hour long in prime time on both of those. Especially the Burma one was just amazing, real access, but was only made possible because they were using a campaign group for Burma Justice or Burma Democracy. I can't remember the exact name of the group, but it was their cameraman and it was produced with their help completely. They were the ones who filmed it, and then the production company had to use their judgment and their expertise to produce something that was impartial and balanced for television. My question is, not only citizen journalists, but those groups who are the only ones who would be able to produce and give you that footage, is there sort of an increasingly widening space for using those kind of sources?
Does that cross a line, right?
Okay, so there's two or three things about that. Firstly, we talk about citizen journalism. It covers a whole multitude of things. It covers a person who accidentally experiences or is the eyewitness to something, up to somebody who goes out and deliberately decides they're going to try and film something that'll make the news, up to a lobby group, up to somebody who is an independent or freelance journalist or on the verge of that. And there's a whole scale there and lots of things in between. But as Jean said earlier, the fundamental principles for a broadcaster in particular are unchanged really, and it's what is the quality of this information, how verifiable is it, how trustworthy is it, how accurate is it, and then what you want to do with it. And certainly in current affairs and in documentary you can be more authored. So even on the BBC, it's even easier outside the BBC, but even on the BBC you can have a documentary that has a point of view. But as long as you're transparent about it, and as long as the audience, we're saying audiences are more sophisticated now, as long as they know what they're being presented with and it's transparent, then I think that's entirely possible. And there may well be issues that at some stage you have to put a different point of view in a different programme or whatever. But I think that's absolutely possible. You can, as long as the audience knows what they're being presented with and there's been some proper thought into how verifiable is it and how representative is this material that we're using, and the audience is being given a kind of a transparent perspective on it, then I think that's fine.
Adrian's nodding, but Jean is scribbling. So Jean?
No, Adrian.
No, I agree with that. I mean, it's a bit like the holy grail of news of 20 years ago, which was about verifiable facts. You have to have 3 independent sources triangulated, scientifically to make sure before you can tell the audience something, because you've defined that it's truth. And actually, you know what, you can't most of the time. And now I think we've got to a point where audiences are familiar enough with the different types of media where if you say to them, do you know what, this is what we think is happening, or this is the view as best as we know it, these are the circumstances around how we've got this information. If you're honest at that point, rather like Richard's describing where the materials come from, I think people are up to digesting that.
There's this phrase that, I can't remember who came out with it now, but the transparency is the new objectivity, and I think there's a lot of that.
Yeah.
I'm just going to say something about the dangers to journalism, which you just touched on, because the technological revolution in what it is that journalism is has actually made it much more dangerous for journalists, because in the past there was a curious way in which journalists could claim a kind of immunity because they're going to tell even the enemy's story, but the enemy doesn't need you anymore because it can tell its own story very easily. Secondly, although it's not new that journalists are targeted for what the stories they tell. I mean, I just interviewed last year lots of people in Northern Ireland, and that was a pretty uncomfortable place when you were, you got done over if people didn't like your story, and things could change very fast. So although it's not new, I think that has also come up the agenda. And you're secondly, apart from the general threat to journalism, you're seeing states absolutely targeting not just individual journalists, but what you might call whole journalist chains. So that in Russia, what they've done is not just take out Politskaya, but they've taken out everybody around us. They've actually, who knows who's done it, but they've eradicated a whole strand of journalism very effectively. And so that does make the reporting of difficult places, I think, increasingly difficult. And I was very interested that Richard said you have to leave it to the people on the ground, because I think people on the ground often feel that the security guys straight out of the army in London don't understand newsmaking. But nevertheless, those are real those inhibitions on journalism, it seemed to me, have actually grown in the last 10 or 15 years, not diminished.
No, I think that's true, and it's still an average of 2 journalists a week get murdered for doing their job somewhere in the world. Yeah. And that statistic has held true for over 10 years now. So.
Yeah.
Sir.
So I'm Peter von Eichberg, I'm an IT consultant from Germany, so only a news consumer. I have a question, coming back to the initial question, if you have a black hole where you have limited access, how good is the collaboration with other Western news agencies? Is it organized? Is it simply knowing each other from the same hotel? Or is it more competition that you don't want to work together?
We all have our own clubs. You know, the BBC is a member of the European Broadcasting Union, which is a massive club of broadcasters across Europe and the world, which looks to cooperate, you know, on material. Sky is a member of an organisation called ENEX, which is of non-state broadcasters, if I can describe it like that, who equally look to cooperate and collaborate on, you know, sharing material. And we have various other partnerships as well with individual stations and other providers around the world. So there's quite a lot of cooperation, actually. And you're right, it's a tremendous resource for us. I mean, one of the problems, actually, with this new media world in which we live in is there's just so much stuff out there, sifting it, and, you know, trying to make judgments about what's good, what's bad, what's new, what's not new, what's relevant, what's been filmed by some group, whether you know, there's an avalanche of material, and that's when these judgments about what's on the agenda, what's not on the agenda become even more, you know, difficult to deal with. So yeah, we all do have partnerships, and in fact, the world is joining up even more, and economics is driving that, clearly. And, you know, the BBC, I know, is doing a lot more with ABC News America. In America, we're doing a lot more internally within News Corporation to join up with our own sister stations around the world. And, you know, we're not doing that because, you know, separate from the facts that costs, there's a big pressure on cost. And we need to try and drive down cost and upscale content. And that's a fact of what we're doing now.
The gentleman in the back. Oh, you, sir.
Mark
and then the gentleman next to him.
Mark Jones of Reuters. I had a question for Adrian about, back to Iran, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
At the height of the Iranian protests, Sky News' website did something incredibly radical, which went largely without comment. You put a live feed of some tweeters on your homepage.
Yeah.
I congratulate you for making that experiment. Could you tell me a bit more about the thinking behind it, how you chose those tweeters, and also whether they knew that they were effectively broadcasting to your homepage?
Yeah, good point. The last point I can't answer. Actually, I don't know the answer to that, I must admit. The first part of it was very much we did feel that we were on this sort of this wave of Twitter becoming an incredibly useful tool, particularly with that, you know, that series of demonstrations that we had there. And I referred to it earlier, we did do a lot of deep digging to try and only post those people who we had very good reason to believe were genuine, were relevant, were topical, and were there. You know, as I said earlier, there were quite a few people who weren't, and we found as the story went on, there was almost an explosion of Twitterers on the demonstrations, many of whom who we then discovered weren't there. So, you know, maybe that was a brave or an innovative thing to do. Maybe it was a bad idea, maybe it was a good idea, I don't know. But we tried it because we felt that tool, the Twitter tool, was definitely the hour to try and maximize the use that we were getting out of it. And we didn't have many options at the time. We were asked to leave. You know, it was a sort of being asked to leave with guys outside the hotel door, so it was that kind of ask. And you know, and so we did leave, and then, you know, we didn't have anyone inside, and even actually the freelancers who we had good relationships with were very well clamped down upon. So we found ourselves with few places to turn. So it was to UGC, it was to Twitter, and we found that to be very popular because a lot of people, you know, don't have a Twitter account, but actually are used to using the Sky News and other websites. So we were arbitrating, you know, that tool, if you like.
And did you get positive feedback on that?
Yeah, I think so. I think we did. Yeah, I think we did. And, you know, it was a way of bringing information to light that we wouldn't have otherwise had. And so, in that sense, I think it was a success. Was everything absolutely 100% accurate or topical, or, you know, was that tweet from that particular rally? Was that someone trying to get people to a rally, or was it actually tweeting about a rally that was actually happening? These are the things that we really struggle with, as you did as well. And even now, we're not totally sure whether we did, you know, completely well on that or not. But we felt that was the judgment we were making at the time.
John Bell from the Office of Tibet, Dalai Lama's office here in London. Going back to the events in Tibet last year, not only was the whole area totally shut off for Western and outside media, but there was intense criticism and comments by Chinese netizens about two particular news organizations, the BBC and the CNN reporting, and also, from what I gathered, criticism from the Chinese government. What specifically do you think was the reason for the BBC and the CNN being kind of highlighted in terms of the reporting? And how did the BBC respond in that specific case? And how do news organizations respond more generally when governments apply pressure like that?
I assume, I don't know the short answer is I assume the BBC and CNN, because we, are Western international broadcasters and two of the biggest brands in international broadcasting, and I imagine that's why we were particularly singled out. How do we respond? When we come under pressure from all sorts of directions on all sorts of issues and stories day in, day out. So the way we respond is much the same. If we have particular criticisms or complaints that are raised, then we have to look into them and we have to dig into it and ask ourselves some hard questions about it. But we carry on reporting it as fairly and as fully as we feel we can and should. And so, the editorial discussion on the individual news programs and so on is absolutely about what is the story, what is the way we should be reporting it and why, and what's the the fair and the BBC way and the BBC approach to this story. And then, if there's pressure coming in, we will work out whether or not we think it's legitimate or not before we decide whether we need to react. And as far as I'm aware, I don't think we did particularly change our view of that story or our way of reporting it as a consequence of that pressure.
Gentleman in the back, and then
Hi, Matt Grace, barman at the Frontline Club. I'd like to know, we've already spoken about how you react to a news story in terms of new media when it occurs, and the importance of returning to news stories afterwards. In terms of broadcasters, how much energy and resources is put into setting up networks and people on the ground in areas where there is going to become a story? For example, if we're talking about Burma, which you've rightly sort of designated an ongoing story, next year there will be democratic elections in Burma, and it's quite right to agree that following those elections, there's a good chance there's going to be this sort of civil unrest that was seen in 2007. How much effort is put into making sure that when that does happen, as it probably is going to happen, you will have people on the ground who are not going to be thrown out of Burma. You will have people that aren't sort of obviously connected to Western journalism who are still going to be in place to report on that.
who wants to reveal their secret plans?
Not me. We do put quite a lot. I mean, we put a lot of effort into Pakistan actually in the last year, because that has been an area for us. Talking about places where we're denied access. We haven't talked about Pakistan, but Pakistan has become a real problem for us because even even 2 years ago we were excluded from going to several of the tribal provinces. And now, more recently, the government looked to exclude you even from Peshawar and the Northwest Frontier Province. And that is a story, talking about getting stories on the 6 o'clock news, as it were, that is a story that is both a foreign story, if you like, but also incredibly relevant to the domestic market as well. And so it ticks both boxes from that point of view. So for using Pakistan instead of Burma as your sort of example, we've put a lot of effort into trying to generate a, if you like, a local network of journalists who can, be invisible, frankly, and still do our news gathering for us by proxy. And in certain countries, we absolutely need to do that. I've just make a note of the Burmese elections. I haven't done enough on that actually, so maybe we should get on that one. But with areas like Sri Lanka, the end of the Tamil Tiger movement, if you like, or as it seems, was something that was a little bit sprung, certainly upon us as a news organisation. We hadn't done as much prep, if you like, on getting into the camps on the East Coast. We didn't have the network, technology wasn't there to help us out, and so we were caught out. Lots of other news organisations were caught out as well. We do think about these things, and of course now there are more tools in our favour. For example, in Pakistan, there's a very vibrant freelance community of journalists there who are all very familiar in FTPing material here, there and everywhere, and are incredibly skilled at doing that. And they also face some of the issues of repression that we've been talking about. So a lot of work, but we don't get it right all the time, I wouldn't say.
The gentleman in the corner.
Hello, Gerard Briscoe, London School of Economics. The panel's spoken about how this new technology has worked in blackout scenarios. I was wondering if the panel would like to comment on how these technologies could change or evolve in the future, that they might actually be more effective in these blackout scenarios.
Tough one.
So just so I understand the question, is how these technologies are going to develop so they can be more effective in blackout scenarios. Is that the question?
Yes. I mean, how do you think that they would be more effective?
Well, I think the crucial issue around that, which we shouldn't take for granted, is internet access. And we saw in Burma that a country can still close down the internet effectively if it wants to. China controls access to which sites it wants its population to see and which it doesn't want to see very effectively. Iran does the same, and actually this kind of internet filtering is increasing. And if you look at the OpenNet initiative and so on, you can see those areas of the world, and it's particularly Asia and the Middle East, I think, but a lot of other areas as well, that are getting into more and more internet filtering. And I think we shouldn't take for granted that the internet will always be as global and as open as it currently is. We may all hope that it will be, and with good fortune and a lot of work, that it will continue to be open and global. But it's not absolutely certain. So I think the biggest issue, one of the big risks, I think, is that the internet as we currently experience it will change very significantly, and that may be government interests, it may be corporate interests, it may become less open, it may become less global, and countries can absolutely still control access to the internet within their boundaries if they choose to do so, and some absolutely do choose to do so. So, the extent to which social media or Twitter or mobile phones or whatever develops, I'm sure they'll develop in ways that I can't predict. But actually the fundamental issue, I think, is continuing to work for a global and open access to the internet, and there are considerable pressures on that at the moment.
Gentleman in the back.
Good evening. William Horsley, former BBC correspondent, now running or helping to run the Centre for Freedom of the Media based in Sheffield. John, I'd like to pick up John Owen's point about maybe the media in this environment that we see of more authoritarian governments and outwitting the journalists. I recall Jamie Shea here in May on World Press Freedom Day talking openly about how they'd managed to divert journalists during the Kosovo war, prepackaging the stories extremely successfully. And I just wonder whether these 2 points, John's point about maybe you should batter harder when the black holes appear, to whether, broader question, whether the media now, the mainstream media, ought to be in a position of raising their game in another sense, which is of uncovering the black holes that we're not really being told about. In other words, are we not swallowing the government story in a number of areas, foreign governments and our own, in ways that people realize after the event they get extremely heated about? It clearly happened over coverage of the build-up to the Iraq War, for example. And now we're discovering about what our government has done towards Libya. We've heard about Sri Lanka, Gaza, all these things. They seem to me to fall into a bit of a pattern. And to take another example from Jean's remarks about Russia, there was a BBC 10 o'clock piece about the personality cult, about Putin, at the time of whatever it was. It was when he bared his chest again. And it did strike, on Summer Holiday, it did strike me that it was done by a very experienced correspondent, but it was rather naive in the sense that, is this really the way that we want to tell the story about the Russia led by this man who is preventing us from understanding what's going in the country? His government is stifling the journalists. In other words, we as journalists now have to tell people more about what it is that we're not being told, that the barriers to the circumstances within which we work. You mentioned it in relation to Gaza. You say, well, we're dealing with a local person. This is not an authorized thing. You do it with Twitterers. This is not authorized, and so on. I think maybe the time has come. Let me put it to you: it's thought-provoking. You know, has not the time come when we have to batter harder against the governments?
That sounds more like a statement, a very good one, than a question, unless anybody wants to answer. Gentleman here.
Tomas Van Hutreeve, I'm a freelance photographer. If we're speaking about media black holes, I thought that North Korea should come up at some point. Has television news completely failed us in the coverage of North Korea? It seems like more often than not, when I turn it on, what I see is a retransmission of the provocations of Kim Jong-il rather than any real reflection of what's happening in the country.
What does one do with North Korea other than go in on a tour bus? Is there any answer to this?
Well, it just so happened we had two of our senior representatives attend the North Korean annual embassy luncheon today, which takes place in Ealing, where they have their embassy in a semi-detached house. This is all part of our concerted campaign to try and get into North Korea, which we've been mounting over a period of 7 years, so far unsuccessfully. Yeah, it's like the example, if you like, of a denial of access causing a problem. Gee, wouldn't we like to be in North Korea doing stories about just how bad is it in terms of food shortages? What is it like? You know, what is it like being an ordinary North Korean living an ordinary? There's so many. We would love to do all of those things. Do you know what? It's really hard. I mean, last year we tried to accredit ourselves to cover the North Korean karate championships as a way in of trying to kind of go in and do a story which was sort of, you know, positive, and then do all sorts of other stuff that probably wasn't so positive. That failed as well. So we do try quite hard to crack that nut, and it's bloody hard. And are we failing? Yeah, we are failing. Yeah, definitely we're failing. And any ideas over and above the ones I've had already, please submit them on a postcard.
The lady on the second row.
My name is Federica. I'm an Italian journalist, so I may be biased using Italy as a case study. But when Italy is reported, the black holes are completely ignored. We speak often about our prime minister, but whatever happens surrounding the actions of our government is quite frankly ignored. So my question is about the black holes that are around us, even in England perhaps, and what we as journalists and you as representatives of media organizations can do to take those cases in consideration. And speaking of Italy, for example, I've hardly ever heard mention the treatment of immigrants or of Roma gypsies in England or outside the country. And it's only those NGOs and those desperate activists that really speak about it. So how do we make them popular? How do we get them into the consciousness of people reading the news and interested in them? And how do we get them into the trending topics of Twitter, regardless of the technological advancements that are in a country?
How do we?
That's a very tough question.
Yeah, what's the answer? Yeah. I mean, seriously, what is it?
I'm asking you because I've just started out my career. I'm not a professional journalist, so...
Actually, I quite recently proposed that Italy should be... I've just done the beginnings... I've done an introduction for a report for Soros on broadcasting all across Europe, and they'd put lots of countries on the health warning list, and then they'd gone back, and Italy was... So I said, well, I can't think why we don't have a campaign for throwing Italy out of the EU, as it would not get into the EU if it was an accession state. The conditions of its media would not now let Italy get into the EU. So if you'd like to join my campaign, everybody said you can't possibly throw Europe out of the EU, but as it would not now meet the accession conditions of being an EU state, it seems to me there's rather a strong case. So that might.
It's a good story.
It's a good story.
Go to TV Europe, the EU map,
yes,
which is TV across Europe.
Exactly.
And you can read all about it.
But
very good it is too.
I think if I just briefly say one thing, it's not a facetious response. You know, one of the issues that we all share is how do we get a greater value placed on journalism again, because
Absolutely.
I've spent 35 years as a journalist, and I can't remember a time when, as a profession, and the values of what a serious journalists are trying to do have been so undervalued. And the business at the minute is imploding, and we see it imploding economically. You know, the bureaus are closing everywhere, newspapers are shutting down, there's an economic crisis underpinning journalism, TV audiences are in long-term decline. The internet is atomized and fragmented, and there's no way of really making sustainable models there yet, as we know everyone's struggling to do that. And as a consequence of that, there is less public support for serious journalism.
Yeah.
And one of the kind of themes that's popped up through this discussion has been, why can't we get people to want to care about Burma, and why can't they want to care about the black holes? The truth is, I'm sure most of us in this room do care about these things, but actually my experience is people out there care less and less about it. And I think it is maybe Italy is one example of some of that.
What
but
I'm worried about is not just the fact that people in general don't care about it, it's people that are next to that black hole.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm sort of agreeing with you. My only hope for this, I suppose, is that I think we are in the midst of a really profound disruption in business of journalism and in news, and we're right in the middle of the kind of maelstrom of that disruption at the moment. And it may take 5 or 10 years, it might take 20 years, historical kind of timeline for us to emerge with something at the other end of that, where I hope and believe that journalism will come through again, because we all think it matters.
Gentleman on the front row has the last question.
I'm an academic historian and a news consumer. Two things about the connection between reporting and explaining. First was a couple of stories from the BBC from Zimbabwe. I've been used to them having a little peek hole camera when they went up and down empty supermarket shelves. And then there was this report where suddenly the reporter was back in Zimbabwe and was going up and down a full set of supermarket shelves. And I thought, surely it was fascinating to see, but at no point did the reporter tell me what had happened that meant that the situation, both of the reporter and the supermarket, was it a very local event, or did it indicate that something absolutely fundamental had happened in Zimbabwe? There was no reflection on. So when you go back sometimes with a story, you also ought to go back and say, why is the story not the same story as it was? And this raises a more general question about explaining. There's a number of, the particular field I'm interested in is to do with the role of ethnicity in conflict. And a big database has shown that actually ethnicity is very rarely got anything to do with conflict. But this person also then showed why reporters, when they go to places where there were conflict, particularly in somewhere like sub-Saharan Africa, instantly pull down ethnic categories in order to explain it, in order to make sense of it. And my question is, to what extent would you call upon academics to try and help you with your explaining when you report?
You do.
Yeah, we do all the time, basically. I mean, I think making current affairs, academics are probably the first port of call, quite often.
Just on the point about Zimbabwe and the context of that, very interesting point about news management there. The backstory to that, in part, Zimbabwean government now, power-sharing government, trying to portray to the world that it's now open and democratic and free and has decided that we're all unbanned and has invited all of us back in.
It was just a mistake.
It's
a misunderstanding.
They misunderstand you as well, and they misunderstood. And now we're all being invited back in to sort of tick the box so the IMF and the EU and everyone else can start turning the taps of the money back on. So you're right. I mean, it's important in our broadcasting that we kind of explain that to people, because that's the backstory of us suddenly popping up not on secret cameras at the moment, because that's the reality. So they're attempting to spin us, and that's a big one to try and highlight.
Exactly.
I think on that point we'll have to end. I'd just like to pick up on one of his last comments, because it's something that's very dear to my heart. The biggest black hole is the black hole of the budget, the DIS budget. And it's particularly an American problem, but you see tendencies here that perhaps you're suffering very much from, in a lesser degree, to the same problem. They're simply not. The people who manage the news organization aren't willing to spend the money to send people to expensive places anymore. They say they don't have the money. They say the public isn't interested. It's cause and effect, perhaps. I don't know what you do about it, but to me, that's the biggest black hole of all. And now I'd like to thank our panelists. Richard Sambrook and Adrian Wells, who gave us their valuable time. The world must have stopped for the last hour. I haven't heard your blackberries. And Jean Seaton, who gave us the value of her long knowledge and reflection and, on the problems of journalism. So thank you very much.